All right, well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in this fine country of ours, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, From the Top Down to the Bottom Up, Making Campus Safety an Institution-Wide Priority. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs, and I'm really going to be functioning as a moderator today, making sure that the webinar is running along smoothly and that you get all of the content that you need. Joining me today is Rob Buelow from EverFi, who's the sponsor for today's webinar. Rob Buelow is a public health professional and award-winning expert in campus sexual assault prevention. He brings over 10 years of higher education experience as a student activist, prevention trainer, researcher, entrepreneur, and strategic consultant. Rob serves as the Vice President of Partner Education at EverFi, where he oversees prevention research and thought leadership, while also contributing to the ongoing development of EverFi's leading online prevention platforms. He's received state and national recognition for his work as a prevention educator, including the 2009 Outstanding Prevention Educator Award from the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Rob has also managed major projects as a researcher and consultant for public, private, and government sector organizations. Rob holds degrees in psychology and women's studies from Penn State University and a Master of Science from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he focused his studies on social behavioral sciences and health communications. So we're so excited to work with Rob today and to pass along this information to all of you. I also have with me today our colleague Megan, who's going to be the producer for today's webinar, and she'll work with you if you have any tech-related questions throughout the session. I'm first just going to review a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We encourage you to interact with us by typing in the questions and comments using the questions tab that you'll see in your control panel. We'll also have some times throughout the webinar in which we ask you to share your thoughts or provide some feedback. We'll run through how to use that technology in just a moment. We will record today's webinar, and it'll be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email. As many of you know, the Cleary Center is a national nonprofit. We do a lot of work in campus safety, and for the past few years, the Cleary Center has used National Campus Safety Awareness Month as an opportunity to respond to key questions and requests that we are hearing in the field by creating professional development programs and resources that you can participate in throughout the month or access through our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website after the fact. If you haven't yet had the opportunity to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking the link in the control panel. Doing so will make sure that you'll be able to access that webinar recording when that email is sent to all of you. The theme for this year is moving forward together, and that was one of the reasons why we were so excited to be able to provide this particular webinar, because one of the things that we see frequently as we're working with colleges and universities across the country, that buy-in from leadership in particular is so critical in being able to do all of the great work that you're doing. And so this webinar is a really good opportunity to think about how can we really get buy-in from a number of different people on our campus. We know that campus safety is important, not just to all of you on the webinar, but to the institution as a whole. So how can we make sure that across the campus we're communicating that and that our leaders are really a part of this discussion as well? So as we go through, make sure that you're paying attention to some of these key areas in terms of the technology that we'll be using. You'll notice on the screen that questions tab is highlighted. That's what you're going to be looking for in your control panel. If you have a question for the Cleary Center or as part of the presentation, that's where you can type that in there. And anytime we ask you a chat question, that's also where you will respond. We'll also have a poll integrated into today's session, so that will look much like the image that you see on the screen. We're going to ask something a little bit different than what your favorite color is, but the concept is the same. You'll be able to plug in your answer, and we'll be able to see what the results are for a number of you participating in today's webinar. So thank you again for joining us today, and we're going to hand it over to Rob.
Well, thanks so much, Megan and Abigail. It's a pleasure to be working with you all in collaboration for such an important month. And, you know, as I talk about this conversation around institutionalizing a commitment to prevention, I'm really excited about that topic. It's something that you'll probably hear in the excitement of my tone. You can't all see on the other side of the screen me gesticulating my excitement for this particular webinar, but this is just such an important topic for us to be thinking about. And I want to start the webinar by describing two related paradoxes that have huge implications for campus safety. First, there's been a great deal of focus over the years on student drinking and sexual assault. Yet high-risk drinking rates have remained pretty stagnant on college campuses, and the prevalence of sexual assault in college continues to hover right around the same level that we found first 30 years ago when we began to study this issue in earnest. Additionally, while we know these issues are costing our institutions huge amounts of money when bad things happen, campuses are spending far too little resources on building prevention strategies that can help keep these things from happening in the first place. So that's what I'm here describing, the campus safety paradox. And campus sexual assault prevention is a really great case study in that. So here you can see a newspaper article from the New York Times in late March of this year weighing in on the costs associated with sexual assault, the money being spent to, as this title says, deal with sexual misconduct complaints. So here you can see it's laid out that colleges and universities are spending from a range of thousands to millions of dollars responding to sexual misconduct complaints. And it's really important for us as prevention-minded professionals to have a good grasp of the economic impact of these issues. And we're certainly going to talk more about that later in the webinar. But it is important for us to point out here that these resources are focused mostly on ex post facto spending on response-related initiatives. And that's critically important. But those resources typically far outweigh the amount of money and attention being given to really effective, robust prevention strategies. And I think it's also important to note that we can't just be looking at sexual assault prevention as a budget line item rather than a mission-critical priority. And that brings me to a response to this New York Times piece from Dr. Stephen DeSalvo, the president of St. Anselm College. And he really weighed in saying that, yes, we are spending a lot of money around this issue, and the funding and the bureaucracy are wise investments in the future of today's students who are ultimately tomorrow's leaders, and that our top priority as custodians of our student body is to make sure that they're safe during their time on campus. So he's talking about resources here, but also connecting them with something bigger. And I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. DeSalvo soon after his response to this New York Times piece came out as an op-ed, and he described to me that he really does view sexual assault prevention as a key presidential priority. And I think that this is a very fitting statement and perspective for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. But I do want to get a sense, though, of how that prioritization of sexual assault prevention resonates with the outward perspective of senior leaders at your institution, saying that this is the top priority of custodians of our student body, that this is a presidential priority that we've got to put above almost everything at our institution. How much does that align with the outward perspective of your senior leaders at your institution? So here I want to launch our first poll so that you can weigh in about how similar or dissimilar this perspective from Dr. DeSalvo is from senior leaders at your institutions. Is this something we're doing because we view it as a top priority, or is this something we're doing because we're being told we have to? So we've got only about 30% of folks have voted. I'd love to get this over 50% so that we can really get a representative sample from folks. So what we're starting to see here, we're getting close to about 50%. Reach 50, give folks just another moment to weigh in if you haven't voted yet. Okay, great. So we can go ahead and close that and share the results. And here you can see that about 75% of you all are saying that this is similar or very similar to the prioritization of the perspective of senior leaders at our institutions. And I think that that's great, that it's being taken on and being positioned as a key mission critical priority. But the webinar that we're going to continue to talk through is that translating to the degree of prioritization, the degree of institution-wide commitment, and the degree of resources that we need to be able to do our work well. Thank you all so much for weighing in. All right, so we can go back to the webinar slides. Here we are. Great. So as I mentioned, this term institutionalization is really the focus of the webinar today. And so I want to spend some time actually talking through what we mean when we say institutionalization. So as a verb, to institutionalize is to cause a custom or practice to become accepted and used by many people. Whereas institutionalization, there's a great definition from the Business Dictionary that institutionalization is a process which translates an organization's code of conduct, mission, policies, vision, strategic plans into action, ultimately aiming at integrating fundamental values and objectives into the culture and structure of our organizations, of our institutions. And that's what institutionalization is all about. And so in learning more about the institutionalization efforts of college campuses across the country, I interviewed a number of folks doing great prevention work on college campuses. And in one conversation with the director of community safety at Reed College, a gentleman named Gary Granger, we're talking about institutionalization. He said, you know, Rob, that term you're using, institutionalization, and what you call institutionalization, I call leadership. And when we frame institutionalization as a leadership issue, we may have a lot more success getting more people bought into prevention as a leadership challenge and a leadership priority. And I'll certainly be coming back to Gary Granger a little bit later on in the webinar. So getting into the nitty-gritty of how institutionalization looks on a campus in terms of prevention, this ranges from things like infrastructure and physical space to the websites of our institution, the total budget allocated for prevention, our staffing, the presence of collaborative task forces or working groups around prevention and how productive and active those groups are, as well as who's represented in them, the outward commitment around prevention from senior leaders, and the inclusion of prevention as a priority in institutional strategic plans and mission and vision statements. And I like to summarize all of this by what I call the 4 Ps of institutionalization. That's places, purse strings, people, and priorities. And over the course of the webinar, we'll be talking through each of those 4 Ps and providing some great examples that we can all take with us to greater institutionalized prevention at our institutions. But before we do that, we have to ask ourselves, why does institutionalization matter? And I think that this is a bit of a rhetorical question, and I'll get to why. But here at EverFi, we think about prevention as a process rather than a program. But I do know we all sometimes get stuck in that trap of thinking through our prevention work through the lens of the programs that we do. And programs are really important, but to be effective, programs have to be supported by strong and consistently enforced policies. They must be informed by a set of critical processes that effectively utilize research, data, and key stakeholders to make sure that we're doing the best work that we can do for our institution, and they must ultimately be built upon a foundation of institutional buy-in and commitment to prevention work. This framework is informed by extensive research that we've done here at EverFi on prevention best practice. And we've translated these pillars of prevention into a set of assessments that we use to help campuses actually measure their alcohol prevention efforts and their sexual assault prevention efforts compared to best practices. So that question of why institutionalization matters, as I said, is rhetorical, in that institutionalization truly is the base of the pyramid. It is the foundation of all of our prevention efforts. We can understand best practices, but that won't matter if we don't have the resources and institutional will to effectively execute those prevention plans. When we talk about the importance of institutionalization, we're basing that on an assumption that more buy-in and more resources will lead to better programs and better policies, and better programs and policies will contribute to better outcomes. That's the assumption of why institutionalization matters, is that it flows more buy-in, better programs, better outcomes. In May, there was some interesting research that came out from the RAND Corporation where they explored previous studies and conducted some new analyses about the connection between social spending and health outcomes. And they confirmed what prior research had shown. Countries with greater social expenditure had better health outcomes. But the question that we have to all be asking is, can this be extrapolated to apply to prevention work at higher ed institutions? So these next two slides, I want to caveat in that they are the most research and statistics heavy slides of the whole presentation. These were prepared for our annual research summit, which took place this past June. And so I want to just sort of talk through a little bit of the data that I'm going to share here. First is that we're looking at data from our diagnostic inventories. So those are the assessments that we built based on those best practice frameworks that came out of the research that we did on comprehensive prevention strategies. And what we were looking at is, does a school's institutionalization score, because once a school goes through these assessments, they get scored on how they do, does their score in institutionalization connect to the score that they get in programming? Or put another way, does institutionalization influence programming for better or worse? And a few things to clarify before reading too deeply into this analysis. So for those statistics and research folks, minded folks out there, our diagnostic inventories haven't been tested for validity and reliability. And the alcohol diagnostic inventory that I'm going to share results from on this slide has had some slight adjustments over time. So I just wanted to share some of those caveats. And then also as a primer on statistics, including correlation and linear regression, you'll recall from Statistics 101 that a correlation is really about relationships between two things. Does a change in one thing relate to a change in another thing? As one thing goes up, does another thing go up as well, or does that other thing go down? And that indicates whether there's a positive or negative relationship or correlation. And correlation ranges from small to medium to large based on the numbers that you can see here in this box. And those correlations can be positive or negative depending on the relationship. And someone's asking if there's a graph and is there a way to see it. I will be showing the graph shortly, but I just want to get through a little bit of the background on correlation. But I love the enthusiasm to see the data. So the other thing I want to say here is correlation doesn't imply causation. That's Statistics 101. Correlation does not mean causation. It's really just a measure of how differences in one variable relate to differences in another variable. So remember these numbers here in terms of small, medium, and large correlation. And here you can see that a graph coming up. Oops, it should be coming up. There we go. This is a scatter plot that looks at schools based on their programming scores here on the y-axis and their institutionalization scores on the x-axis. So each of these dots here in this scatter plot represent individual institutions. And the slope of this line here, you can see it's a slight positive slope, indicating that this is a slight positive correlation. So the correlation here between institutionalization scores and programming scores is 0.28. So you recall that anything below 0.30 is considered a small correlation, and we're just below that threshold of 0.30. But this is a statistically significant finding. And so while correlation is really about the slope of that best fit line, regression talks about how well that line fits the data, or the degree of variance around this line, so how closely these dots fall to this line. So it's really seeking to understand how much of the variance in one thing can actually be explained by another thing. So here you can see that the R-squared value of our linear regression model shows that roughly 8% of the variance in a school's programming score can be explained by their score in institutionalization. And that's a strongly statistically significant finding. So about 8% of how a school does in programming is attributable to how that school does in institutionalization. So that's pretty interesting. But let's look at sexual assault. So based on our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, we had far fewer schools so far go through the sexual assault diagnostic. But here you can see the slope of that line is far steeper, still a positive relationship as institutionalization goes up. programming goes up, as you can see by the slope in the line. And whereas the correlation around institutionalization and programming for alcohol was 0.28, this correlation is 0.43, once again statistically significant, much closer to that 0.50 threshold of a strong correlation. And for social science research, a 0.43 correlation is a very, very strong and significant finding for social science research. And then in terms of linear regression, the R-squared value is 0.19, which is once again very statistically significant, and it means that roughly 19% of the variance in sexual assault programming can be explained by institutionalization. So a far greater degree of reliance of institutionalization or of programming on that institutionalization score. So you may be wondering, why is that R-squared value so much higher around sexual assault than for alcohol? And I can only hypothesize. We haven't dug too deep into these findings, but perhaps it's because alcohol prevention has been in place and has been studied for really decades longer than we've really had a concerted focus on studying sexual assault prevention. And so there may be a greater understanding of how to do good alcohol prevention efforts so that it's not as reliant on institutionalization to do well in programming. That's simply one hypothesis for the data. But all that being said, very interesting findings showing that institutionalization is very connected to programming scores at institutions. So in addition to this analysis, we've also just mapped schools in terms of how they're doing around institutionalization. So all of the schools that have gone through our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, we've plotted their score out of 100 and found that on average, schools are right around a 50.3 out of 100 in institutionalization. Some schools doing far better in institutionalization, some schools not doing so well at all in institutionalization, and lots of schools falling somewhere in the middle. And then with alcohol prevention, we see a similar distribution in that some schools doing really well, some schools doing not so well. Once again, this is a difference in how they're scored. The sexual assault one is a 0 to 100 scale. The alcohol inventory is an A to an F scale. And here you can see the average institutionalization score around alcohol prevention is about a D. So the point here is that we've got a lot of room for improvement in this domain. And so I hope that this starts to get us thinking about how we can begin to increase the institutionalization of alcohol and sexual assault prevention at our campus as we begin to explore the 4 Ps of prevention. So let's dive in, starting with places, because, you know, it's all about that space, I hope that that didn't fall too flat in a webinar. I can't hear you all laughing at my corny joke. Feel free to chat in a ha-ha if you liked it. But the built environment really does come up a lot in the field of public health. So think about targeted behaviors that we want to see from our students, or really from anyone. If those behaviors aren't accessible or supported by the spaces and places that people live, it might be hard to get them to engage in those behaviors. So think about healthy eating. It's hard to eat healthy if we don't have access to markets that sell fresh produce. Same things with things like bike lanes or walking paths. It's hard to be physically active if we don't have space that accommodates physical activity. So the same thing can be said with student health, wellness, and safety. And over the past few years, we've highlighted schools that are making good use of physical space on campus to support health and wellness and safety initiatives. And so this is one example that I saw in an article from the University of North Dakota. And stakeholders there at UND came together to form the Healthy UND Coalition, which proposed a multi-dimensional concept of wellness for the school. So here you can see the 7 different dimensions of wellness that they defined, and each of those different dimensions is represented by a corresponding service or activity within a student wellness center that they built in a very central location at that institution. So that's one very literal example of how the built environment is being established to provide services and space to support wellness-related initiatives. There was also just a few days ago, and I wasn't able to incorporate it into this webinar, but I do want to read you a quote from an article that came out in Cincinnati.com, actually, and it was called "More Funding Policies Needed for Rape Prevention." And so the quote that I wanted to share with you is, as students are exchanging innovative ideas and debating critical concepts, their teaching must involve discussions of consent culture. But how much of their tuition costs will cover mandatory classes on gender equality and social justice? How much time and space will our university presidents, deans of students, athletic coaches, professors, residence hall advisors, and Greek life campus leaders allocate to the promotion of consent culture, waving it proudly like a symbol of excellence on a school banner? Does consent culture even get discussed in our lecture halls, in our campus boardrooms, on the football fields, in the bars, at the parties, or in the dorm rooms? So that quote goes a lot deeper in saying we might not be necessarily building a student wellness center around these issues, but we absolutely have to be finding ways to bring these messages into the spaces and places where our students are living, learning, engaging socially, having relationships. We've got to meet them where they are. And if we're talking about meeting students where they are, we've got to be talking about the digital environment that students are living in. So there was a 2015 study that showed that most schools include sexual assault information or resources on their university websites. But that finding also found that information was typically pretty hard to locate. It was pretty basic and was often very reactive information. And we've done a similar audit of some of our partner campus websites and found the same sort of thing. Information was pretty often hard to find on campus websites, and I know the search terms to be looking for. So think about the user experience of a student who has just gone through something very traumatic, and how can we remove as many barriers as possible and make this information as accessible as possible for students who may be in the midst of trauma, for example. One really great example of how a school has taken their website and really done a good job making this information accessible is actually American University. So they've gone through and through the search function of their website, if you look up any terms related to sexual assault or relationship violence, you're going to get a response come back with essentially like a Google ad. Like the first responses that come back in that search query are going to be highlighted and called out with the resources available around sexual assault prevention and support services, so that it's very accessible for someone who's looking for any search terms related to these issues. So that's just one example of how one school really optimized their web environment to make this information more accessible. And this isn't just a nice to do thing that makes information easier to access for survivors. It's really a must. There was a Dear Colleague letter that came out last year on Title IX coordinators, and the Office of Civil Rights, or Office for Civil Rights, encourages recipients for campuses to create a page on their website that includes the name and contact information of Title IX coordinators, relevant Title IX policies and grievance procedures, and other resources related to Title IX compliance and gender equity. And they include in this Dear Colleague letter that a link to this page should be prominently displayed on the campus's home page. So I would encourage you all after this webinar to go to your campus's home page and do a quick self-assessment of how accessible your information is as it relates to certainly this federal guidance, but also just making the information easy to find for students in need. All right, going with the alliterative 4P theme, we're going to talk about purse strings next. And purse strings refer to the financial resources that institutions are putting towards prevention. So in our sexual assault diagnostic inventory, we ask schools for the past 12 months, how much recurring funding has been allocated from your institution's budget to prevention efforts, not counting grant-supported work or soft funding, and excluding personnel costs. So these data are not necessarily generalizable because we don't have huge samples of schools that we've included in these studies, but what we found is on average across all schools, for alcohol prevention, there was about $47,000 to $48,000 of budget put towards alcohol prevention efforts, translating to about $4.40 per student. And around sexual assault prevention, about $36,000 being put towards prevention, or about $3.59 being spent per student. And we then went through and actually looked at these depending on whether or not you were a small institution, a medium institution, or a large institution. And on average across all schools, there was about a 33% greater amount of funding for alcohol prevention. And the other noteworthy finding was that small schools were spending 4 to 8 times more than large schools in terms of dollars spent per student. So the absolute number is not as high. Small schools spending about $32,000 for alcohol prevention compared to about $60,000 at large schools. But in terms of dollars per student, that $32,000 translates to $11.33 per student versus under $3 per student at large institutions. And very similar findings were found here around sexual assault prevention. So the 2 points that I want to make here is, one, these numbers are far too low in terms of spending around sexual assault prevention and around alcohol prevention, especially considering the cost that we accrue in responding to incidents that happen at our institutions. But the other thing I want to point out is we shouldn't be looking at these numbers separately. Even though they're presented separately here, we've got to be thinking about what we could do more of or better of if this money was combined, if we weren't thinking about alcohol and sexual assault as siloed parts of our institution, but really interconnected areas that should be providing interconnected resources to address student health and safety. So in terms of prevention budget, I want to now go back to you all and ask you a question. And for this question, you can use the chat box. And I want you to name one specific thing you would do with additional dollars for prevention. So take just a moment and write in some responses in the chat box. What would you do if you had additional budget for prevention? There was one question that came in as folks are using the chat box. Do the prevention budget numbers include community colleges or just four-year schools? The sample was small. These are largely four-year institutions, but I would like to be seeing more and more community colleges utilize this assessment. So that's a great question. Okay, we've got stuff coming in. We've got peer educators, bring in more speakers, bystander intervention, create an app, add staff, do a social media campaign, more money for prevention programs. Currently, no staff would want to hire at least a part-time person, buy drunk driving simulator, complete with a small car, hire an on-campus advocate, web developer, peer ed, staff, bringing in someone who's in recovery. That's hugely important. More resources for students, more programming. Thank you all so much. This is great. Start a program that de-glamorizes alcohol. Legal fees for staff to advise them. Awesome. Some of the questions that we've got to be thinking about as we're considering what we would do with additional budget is, does more always mean better? And I would argue that more does not always mean better. Better means better. And sometimes when we're working with schools, we actually advise them to trim back on some of the things that they're doing. They might be doing 20 to 24 different types of programs at various points throughout the year, and those might all be disconnected in terms of the outcomes that those programs are seeking to achieve. And we might say, listen, you're using some programs that don't have a lot of evidence in terms of their efficacy. You don't have a very streamlined focus of the outcomes that you're seeking for. Let's hone in on a couple really high quality programs that we can really seek to grow at our institution. So we might also be faced with the question, why can't we do more with what we have now? So we have to certainly be thinking about a response to that question. How do these relate to other key priorities is going to be a huge question that we have to think about if we're going to try to make the case for more budget. Is this going to make a difference? And how do we know? And I would argue that You only know that our programs are going to make a difference if we've actually studied what the problems are that we're trying to address at our institutions and can say that these programs are aligned with these unique needs, and we intend to obtain these objectives through the programs that are going to allow us to achieve our goals. That's the process of strategic planning that we've got to be doing a good job engaging in. So I want to conclude on this and thank you all for all of the great questions and comments coming in, that we shouldn't just be talking about programs. And of course you all are talking about staff, you're talking about assessment tools, climate surveys, really important, promotional materials. Perhaps we've got social norms data that we've been collecting, and we should be investing in social norms marketing campaigns to make those data really salient to our communities. Maybe we hire on a graduate intern who can do research for us. Maybe we just have some budget allocated for food at the events that we're doing. We know food brings students in, but food can also bring in staff and faculty for collaborative opportunities that we want to be building. So we've got to have an answer when we are being asked, okay, you want more budget, what are you going to do with more budget? And thank you all so much. Okay, so we couldn't do prevention work. We talked about places, we talked about purse strings. We could not do our work without human resources. So let's talk about people. So once again, in our diagnostic inventory, we asked what the total FTE or full-time equivalent were on campuses whose primary responsibility is devoted to prevention at your institution, including your time, other staff, and paid student help. So once again, you can see the average prevention staff in terms of FTE or full-time equivalent at about 2.4 FTE for prevention around alcohol and about 2.0 around sexual assault. And for comparison purposes across small, medium, and large schools, we wanted to break that down into how many students are there for every one full-time staff person that's doing prevention work. And so the student per FTE ratio is fairly close around a lot of the different school types, except medium-sized institutions here in terms of the absolute numbers. But you can see in terms of the relative students per FTE, how can we expect at a large institution, if we've got one person for every 8,000 students, that we're going to be able to make a meaningful impact on these issues? And how can we try to take this relative number and get closer to the 1 FTE per 1,400 students that we see in smaller institutions? Because we've got to have the human resources to be able to grow and scale our work effectively. One question, someone said, please repeat, do we have to have a Title IX coordinator's name and email address on the front page, or just the department's contact information? Is that sufficient? So once again, going back to the web presence question, the way that the Dear Colleague letter, and I would just encourage you to look at the Dear Colleague letter on Title IX coordinators, and I believe it says that you need to have access to a web page that has that information on it displayed on the front page. So a link that goes to another page that has all that information should be pretty sufficient. But I think the more information we can prominently display, the better. So in terms of staffing, once again, we've got to have more staff in place, especially, and I've asked schools, how does this compare to staffing at your institution? And largely what I've learned is that these numbers are not generalizable, and a lot of schools have a lot less staff in place that are doing prevention work. And so we've got to be thinking about more staffing. We've got to be thinking about other ways that we can better scale our work. But beyond simply having staff in place, we have to be thinking about how our human resources are being utilized. And so one example around AOD prevention, or alcohol and other drug prevention, is taking into consideration the fact that AOD professionals, they certainly play the role of programmer and educator, but these professionals can also build relationships to engage other key stakeholders to support prevention work, helping to ensure that their efforts to support AOD prevention are rooted in best practice, are consistent with other messaging that students are receiving from other places, and that are aligned with the priorities and needs of the institution. So one interesting example is at the University of Central Florida, all AOD programs and policies are reviewed by the quote-unquote AOD czar. That's not the actual title for this person, but they have one person in place who helps to review and give feedback on all alcohol and other drug-related programs and policies, to give input to them before they're implemented on campus, so that they are consistent, so that they are synergistic, so that they are based on best practice. We know, for example, that drunk goggles are not an effective way to engage students around alcohol prevention, or breathalyzer feedback is not effective for alcohol prevention. In fact, students actually tend to try to see who can blow higher breathalyzer scores when you're using breathalyzer feedback as a prevention initiative. So at the University of Central Florida, the quote-unquote AOD czar there would give that feedback to folks that are interested in supporting alcohol prevention work, so that they did truly have consistent and synergistic prevention messages happening on campus. All right, so in terms of building other collaborations, we found in our diagnostic inventories around sexual assault that over 90% of schools have a sexual assault prevention task force or working group or steering committee. However, less than half of these schools have participation or engagement from the most senior leaders at their institution. So these conversations are not making their way up to senior leaders, and senior leaders are not engaging these task forces and working groups with recommendations and mandates around priorities for the institution. But in terms of representation, what we've seen is there's pretty good representation from a variety of key stakeholder groups. So the counseling office, Res Life, 71% of institutions said that they had faculty or researchers as part of their campus task force or prevention working group, students involved in the vast majority of these, diversity and inclusion. But there was also some notable underrepresentation of critical groups, like, for example, legal and compliance offices. Less than half of the schools that have a task force for prevention had legal or compliance officers part of that group. We've got to be finding ways to bring those folks into the conversations. We've got to think about LGBT students, Greek life, local law enforcement, and bringing them in to have a seat at the table of these conversations as well. So making sure that the right folks are at the table having the right conversations is critically important for doing good prevention work. All right, last but not least, we're going to discuss where prevention fits as an institutional priority and describe some strategies to elevate institutional commitment. There was one question that came in around what do you do when some stakeholder groups continue to not be invited to the table? I think that, I'm not sure if you feel specifically that you don't have a voice in those conversations in terms of bringing those folks to the table. I think that these next couple slides around priorities will be really helpful in understanding how prevention and how these issues themselves relate to a variety of institution priorities. So I hope that over the next few slides we'll be able to address that question. I think it's a great one, and how we can continue to bring key stakeholders to the table. So first is thinking about visible leadership around these issues and simply asking the question, are student health, safety, or wellness mentioned as priorities in your institution's strategic plan? So we asked that in our diagnostic inventories, and what we found was that less than 50% of schools included student health, safety, or wellness as priorities in their strategic plan. And I've heard one person say very clearly, if it's not in the strategic plan, it's not a priority. And so if we're not including these things in our institutional strategic plans, how can we expect them to get focus, attention, resources, and prioritization? But success also depends on internal and external visibility of senior leaders around these issues. So we examined the number of times that vice presidents of student affairs or presidents or chancellors spoke outwardly about these issues. So that includes things like press conferences, campus-wide communications, orientation events, et cetera, not one-off email to a faculty member, but really sort of big public communication campaigns. And what we found was that in terms of VPSAs, or Vice Presidents of Student Affairs, roughly 50% of VPSAs issued 4 or more public statements in the past 12 months around alcohol or sexual assault. So that's good. But when we look at presidents or chancellors, we had far fewer public statements about both of these issues, particularly around alcohol. About 50% of college presidents and chancellors, according to the schools that completed this diagnostic inventory, did not speak to alcohol prevention at all in the past 12 months. And 50% of college presidents and chancellors addressed sexual assault just one time or less. And so, that original question we asked around how does Dr. DeSalvo from St. Anselm College's statement around this being a presidential priority translate to your institution, are we asking those questions around visible leadership with regards to these issues of our senior leaders and really holding them accountable to be more present, more visible, more outward in talking about these issues at our institutions? So I mentioned earlier on a conversation I had with Gary Granger from Reed College, and they're doing some great work there at Reed. And I want to highlight Reed for the great work, but also share that Reed College is notable in having the highest per capita sexual assault rates in the country, according to reported incidences. And in my conversation with Gary Granger from Reed College, he was really hopeful that high number of reports is a result of their goal of removing barriers for students coming forward. They want survivors to get help and support, but ultimately they want to hold people accountable and reduce the incidence rate. And I think what was great that came out of this conversation was a quote saying, we're not driving our conversations based on what the White House is telling us. We're basing it on 6 years of data, understanding the needs of our students. And what they've been able to do at Reed College is create a structure that demonstrates the degree of priority given to understanding the needs of students around prevention and response. And they always come back to the fact that it's so important that we keep the human element of these issues right in front of us. And this structure has been sparked by student activism, by campus and community collaboration, and strong presidential leadership, bringing Title IX and student services and community safety into the presidential cabinet. And Gary and others are working closely with survivors and other students to try to learn as much as they can about how to remove barriers for students coming forward and reporting these incidences, ultimately trying to create more accountability and lower incidence rates of these offenses. And each week, the cabinet at Reed College is briefed around Title IX and clery-related issues in terms of both prevention and response. And so a really great example there at Reed College around a strongly institutionalized commitment to sexual assault prevention. So I want to recognize, though, that there are certainly some exemplars of leadership, but there's probably plenty of college presidents out there that might be stuck in a place of wanting to do more around these issues, but not wanting to make these issues actually seem like a problem on their campus. And we've got lots of examples, unfortunately, of the firestorms that tend to accompany tragedies, and this could potentially lead senior administrators to want to avoid the spotlight around these conversations. So rather than accept that sexual assault happens at alarming rates at all colleges and universities, but just isn't being reported, it might lead senior leaders to, or even media perhaps, to tokenize incidences as being one-off tragedies. But leaders who have truly committed to addressing these issues, like Ed Ray, the president of Oregon State University, or our Vice President Joe Biden, who's talked extensively around the need for growing and elevating our commitment to these issues, they seek to understand their far-reaching impact and are striving to not just respond to them effectively, but stay in front of them, proactively seeking to do not just more, but better work. And I had a really good conversation with a woman from the Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, Julie Evans, who said, it's not just about funding and staffing, Rob. If all senior leaders can do around these issues is have a 2-minute soundbite that somebody else wrote for them, how can we expect others on our campus to talk about these issues outside of the folks who are in prevention-related positions? We need to have our senior leaders being and setting the tone by having robust conversations, lots of things to say around these issues, a really nuanced perspective around how this works. So I do want to share that, and I appreciate folks weighing in and saying, yes, absolutely, we need that more. If our senior leaders can't do it, how can we expect others to do it? So in terms of getting this conversation elevated to senior leaders, I recognize that not every school is going to have that degree of commitment that they want and need from their president or chancellor. And so I guess to start, I want to apologize here for what looks to be a very gendered representation of a college president. That certainly wasn't intentional. I was limited by the graphics I had available. But I wanted to share that prevention professionals, all of us as a field, may need to be strategizing ways to better garner more senior level support. And to do this, we've got to consider the ever important question of what's in it for me. And this isn't to say that institutional leaders don't care about these issues. There was research done by Gallup and Inside Higher Ed last year. They took a poll of college presidents, and what they found was 75% of college presidents felt that sexual assault was a significant problem on college campuses, but about that same percentage of college presidents did not believe that it was an issue on their campus. So for us to be more successful, we've got to be able to frame these issues through the lens of mission-critical drivers at our institutions and start to show how sexual assault is connected to the reputation and brand and recruitment of students at our campuses. Safety, risk management, liabilities, certainly costs, fundraising, compliance and regulations, and then the mecca of higher ed, thinking about student success, thinking about retention, thinking about enrollment of students. And the good thing is, those data are all there. We can make those connections. Those connections have already been made in other places, in other research. So I want to share some findings with you, recognizing, though, that these are general aggregate findings, and for us to be most successful, we've got to be able to replicate these findings at our own institutions. So thinking about reputation and brand, there's been research showing that a party school ranking for a school impacts their recruitment or retention. We've found that positive recognition of proactive sexual assault leadership can have really positive effects on the reputation of a school. There was one article from the Harvard Business Review that found that for every scandal that resulted in a major media like New York Times publication about something happening regarding a scandal on a campus, there was, I believe, a 5% drop in recruitment numbers and applicants to that institution. So really interesting. We found from our climate survey that 40% of students felt that school administrators could be doing more to protect them from harm. We've also known of other research showing that we've taken research and built it out, looking at all the different costs attributed to student drinking on a campus. And when you look at that across an institution with an average school size of about 10,000 undergrads, you could assume that about $2 million of lost revenue related to attrition are related to alcohol over a 4-year period. And from United Educators data, we found that about $200,000 is the average cost per sexual assault claim that actually results in litigation. In terms of compliance, in our climate surveys, we found that over 50% of students indicated that they have not received training on how to report a complaint of sexual assault, which calls into question whether or not the schools that they're attending are prioritizing even basic compliance requirements around this sort of training. And then lastly, there's been research showing that 15% of attrition in higher ed is attributable to alcohol, but we're also not just losing our high-risk drinkers, we're losing some of our best and brightest students who are coming onto our campuses and realizing that the alcohol environment of our campuses is inconsistent with their academic priorities, and those students are leaving our institutions as well. We also know that sexual assault and high-risk drinking are directly connected to students' academic performance, and 51% of survivors indicated in our climate survey that they've considered dropping out or transferring to other institutions. So these data can help to elevate our work and garner broader institutional buy-in, but we have to be clear about what we need, what we hope to accomplish, and how the institution and all members of the community can benefit. Now, I was at a conference last year, I was talking about this strategy and talking about these data at a prevention roundtable, and someone raised the point that they've got no way of connecting to the president at their institution to articulate these connections. And this really resonated with me, as when I worked at UC Irvine, for example, I never even saw the president of UCI, yet alone had the opportunity to sit down and talk with him about my work. So I wanted to share some strategies and think together with you all around what approaches can we use for getting our work in front of institutional leaders. So here on the left side of the screen, you can see a pretty crude representation of a student affairs organizational chart. And so there's a couple ways that we can think about this. We can follow the chain of command or work through more direct connections for reaching the college president. So elevating through our boss and their boss and their boss all the way up to senior leaders. Or we can ask the question of who can be my champion and advocate for me when I'm not able to directly reach the president. So maybe we've got good relationships with the athletics director or the Title IX coordinator at our institution, and maybe those people directly report to the president or provost or chancellor and can be champions or advocates for our work. And the way that we frame these conversations really does depend on where key stakeholders are at in terms of things like diffusion of innovation or stages of readiness. Are we dealing with innovators on our campus where our president's saying, how can I be a leader in this? Or are we dealing with a senior leader that says, well, what are other schools doing? Or are we being forced to do this? Do we have to? Or can we get away without doing it? And with those regards, like there's where the compliance conversation comes into play. But in terms of leadership, we've got to be able to understand where our leaders are in terms of how ready they are to adopt new ideas and to grow around the work that they're doing. We've got to understand where they are in terms of their readiness. For example, if we've got a college president who is in denial that sexual assault is an issue at our institutions, we probably don't want to sit down with that person and expect that after one 30-minute conversation, they're going to come out and take complete ownership of this issue at the institution, because chances are after that 30-minute conversation, they still probably won't have the understanding and sensitivity necessary to be a good ally and advocate for this work. So if we're dealing with a president that's in denial around these issues, how can we just take that one step forward to get them vaguely aware of the issues as they exist on the campus, and think about then moving them through these stages of readiness to ultimately get senior leaders to high degrees of ownership. And in terms of the strategies that we can use from the ground up, certainly there's lots of student activism, and the student voice on a lot of campuses really resonates a lot. And so how can we tap student activism and student leaders? How can we use local media to share information, get coverage, start some conversations? Maybe the media is interested in talking about this new campaign you did or some of the data that you found from your climate survey. Because I guarantee the college president at your institution is reading the student newspaper and reading the local news. So how can we get conversations going with local media around the great work that we're doing? How can we bring college presidents or chancellors into events that we're planning? Maybe that's a way to bring them to the table. Plan an event and then invite this person to come to that event and speak at it and open it up. And then maybe they'll stay a few minutes and they'll hear a really powerful survivor story. And then maybe they'll leave that feeling more investment around getting more involved. Maybe our voice isn't able to be loud enough, and in that case, how can we mobilize others around common goals? How can we think about writing a report that relates to some of those key priority areas of senior leaders and then elevate that to them with very specific and clear asks? There was a question around how can you probably work with the media without being a threat to your role on your campus? Absolutely, we have to think about the politics around what is appropriate for us. But I'm not saying that we need to be talking about our institution not doing enough around prevention with local media. We need to have success stories to share with local media. We need to, share data that's already been distributed across the institution that is good for you. And you've got to work with your PR folks, but find out what you can share, but create those relationships, stay within your boundaries, and try to elevate that conversation with local media as well. I want to recognize that we're right at around 2 o'clock. There's 2 slides left that I want to get through, so we might go a minute or two over and then certainly want to ask questions, but we will have a recording of this webinar available as well for folks that need to drop off. All right. So that RAND Corporation research that I shared earlier around social expenditures and health outcomes described that there was typically a significant time lag between when we spent the money and when we saw the outcomes. And so change, as we all know, doesn't happen overnight. Good prevention requires a long-term commitment. And we've got to be thinking about what the short-term, low-hanging fruit, easy wins are, but we ultimately have to be thinking about how we can get our institution connected to that long-game priority of change. And what's happening at Dartmouth is a great case study in this. So this slide shows the timeline for developing a comprehensive and mandatory 4-year sexual assault prevention program at Dartmouth. Huge initiative. And sexual assault really came to the forefront of the conversation there in 2010. And then in 2013, the Department of Ed launched the Title IX investigation. The president of Dartmouth, Phil Hanlon, got very involved in this issue, hosted a summit at Dartmouth, and called in 2015 for a 4-year curriculum in January of that year. And it won't be until the spring of 2020 until all students at Dartmouth have fully engaged with this mandatory 4-year prevention curriculum. So that's 10 years that they've been committed to making this huge, huge step forward for their campus. And so I think that really shows us we've got to be committing to the long game. And so to bring this conversation to a close, and thank you all so much for joining us today, I want to go back to the conversation I had with Dr. Stephen DeSalvo from St. Anselm College, who's their president there. And in that New York Times op-ed that he wrote, he said, as part of our educational mandate, it's our responsibility to ensure that our graduates leave as societal leaders prepared to make the right decisions on the job and in life. We cannot compromise on that directive. And so he said to me, Rob, it has to be at the top list of priorities, whether it's sexual assault, addiction, depression. We have to have a safe and healthy campus. Kicking the can or saying it's not that bad or maybe he didn't mean it does a great disservice to the mission our institutions were founded on. He said to me, if we lose that mission, Rob, we've lost our identity. So with that common identity, that common mission, I want to thank you all so much for joining me for this webinar, and do want to turn it over for any questions that you all have as we conclude. So one question I'm seeing is, how do we get beyond one-time programs? That's a really, really great question, especially on the heels of that Dartmouth case study. Certainly, I would imagine some great stuff's going to be coming out of Dartmouth. They would, I'm sure, welcome you being in touch with them to learn more about their initiative. The University of Dayton is doing some interesting work around tracking every student that participates in every one of their programs and storing all of that information in a database, so they know each student at that school that's gone through each program they've offered and what that program focused on, so they can then begin to target and identify specific subsets of students across the campus that they need to be more invested in terms of reaching. And then here at EverFi, I mean, we are, most folks on this webinar are probably aware that we recently acquired Campus Clarity, and we're really doubling down on our investment in building out a comprehensive catalog of online prevention programs to support you in doing more than just those sort of one-and-done approaches and really reaching students, staff, and faculty across the life course. So really, really great question as well. Is there a clearinghouse or other places to learn about current best practices? There's lots of resources. Certainly, I'd be happy to provide specific resources to folks. The Cleary Center is a wonderful resource. Calcasa and Prevent Connect have great resources. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center have great resources. I would also just encourage you all to find ways to connect with other practitioners at other institutions and learn about the things that they're doing and the things that they're aware of. Some of the greatest richness for me has come not out of research that we've been doing around published literature or websites and what's available online to learn about this, but conversations with folks around the work that they're doing and the work that they're learning about at conferences and conversations with peers. That's where, we're not necessarily talking about peer-reviewed efficacy of the work that they're doing, but these are promising practices that we can seek to model at our own institutions. So with that, we're now at about 5 after. I want to thank you all so much. If there are some additional questions here we weren't able to get to, certainly we can try to respond to those in emails, but I do want to turn it back over to Abby and Megan to bring us to a close. Thank you all.
Sure, and I just want to echo that. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today. What I really loved about this presentation was really some practical examples. So I feel like we all kind of walked away with some homework. Looking at our campus homepage, is there information about Title IX coordinator and our Title IX processes there? Is there anyone who doesn't have a seat at the table that should have a seat at the table? We saw a list of folks that aren't always engaged that might or it would be helpful to bring into the conversation. And also some concrete examples of where this has worked at other institutions and strategies for getting that buy-in. So just as a reminder, the recording for this webinar is going to be available to you. So this might be a resource you participated today, but this might be a resource that you might find is helpful to share with others as you really are working to engage leadership. In addition to that, in your control panel, you'll see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. We'd really appreciate it if you take a few short minutes to share your own thoughts and your own feedback. We like to see what kind of content you're interested in, what you'd like to see more of as we plan additional webinars, not only for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, but throughout the year. Again, this webinar is just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and the recording will be included in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast and available on the Cleary Center's YouTube page. So you can click on the links that have been provided to you to register for those upcoming webinars, to sign up to receive weekly professional development emails during National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and we encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Cleary Center handle for daily campus safety information throughout the month. You can also visit our website to learn more about other training opportunities and learning resources, such as our Cleary Center Collaborative Program, which is a team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Cleary Act compliance. So really looking at buy-in not just from leadership, but within different departments on the campus. If you have any questions, please do feel free to follow up and reach out to us using the email address info@clearycenter.org. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.